All right. So I'll be talking a little bit about teaching remotely. And what I wanted to do was not necessarily to go through all the features of Zoom or something, because there's a lot of, different like technology ways we can do, but try to summarize a few thoughts and then point you to lots of resources. So chances are you're teaching remotely in the fall is probably what every department chair or university administrator is saying. And maybe you're also hearing, maybe you're not teaching remotely in the fall, and maybe you are. But chances are, I think things like large lectures are probably not happening yet in the fall. And I think there's some concern about, will all of your students be able to join, physically in the country where you're teaching as well? So what does that mean for us? I mean, a lot of us had to pivot our teaching very recently, but that happened in a very quick way. And I think almost like all was excused. Everyone did things in a rush, but now we have the summer to think about what might fall teaching look like. And I think one of the challenges of teaching online under this format is that we're teaching students who didn't sign up to learn online. So there's a lot of work out there, and like universities who have been doing teaching remotely for years and years to students who are opting in to be taught online. And that's a different crowd, and there are challenges and benefits that comes with it. And what we're doing, what we'll probably be doing might be something else. Now, at an extreme level, you might hear folks say, well, we used to teach with these and now this is what my day looks like. But I feel like thankfully this is not actually our reality as stats and data science educators. I think we've been doing lots of innovative things with technology so far, but how does that all fit into a new reality where we are completely teaching online and not necessarily seeing our students in the flesh anymore? So I'm going to talk about three three pairs of opposing statements and kind of give my thoughts about how we can navigate this. I think the first thing is the statement, pedagogy should drive technology. And on the other extreme end, technology should drive pedagogy. And I feel like we're probably somewhere in between these, where neither of these statements are entirely 100% correct. I'm thinking where many of us are probably more on the blue side, but the reality is, if you come up with a perfect pedagogy for teaching online, what you think will work perfectly for your course, but somehow the piece of technology that's going to allow it is not feasible to use for you for a variety of reasons, it doesn't really matter how good your plan was, you simply can't implement it. So one of the things that we want to consider is that consistency within a course is crucial. And I think this is always true. We always say things like, stick to what you put on your syllabus. Don't surprise your students mid-semester. But I think it's especially important where you don't have the one-on-one interaction with your students, where asking questions to you, but also equally to peers, might be a lot more feasible for them to have a quick check-in. So you want to really think about how you're going to be designing your courses in terms of what technology components it's going to have. And try to stick to it. That being said, though, it's not like there's no opportunity to change what you're doing. So I think, yes, you want to stick to it, and this consistency is crucial, but you also, after careful thought, should be willing to actually pivot to something else if the technology you've chosen is not working for your class. So it is a decision you want to make carefully, but you also want to be able to pivot, quickly if need be. And I think the best way of doing this is to get early feedback from your students. It's always been my recommendation to try to get early feedback, not even just a mid-semester, like a week 2-3 check-in with your students to see how are things going. Is what I'm doing actually being communicated to you the way I want to? I think it's even more crucial now where there's not as much opportunity to get feedback from them. It's also really important to have consistency across courses. And I think this is an even more challenging thing. One of the things you might want to consider is that You having access to a piece of technology doesn't necessarily mean students have access to it as well. So I'll give you a, an anecdote example here. I personally have had a Zoom account for a variety of reasons that I've been paying for a while now for holding online meetings. And so I have access to it. But if my university hasn't made that an official technology choice, that means my students may not have access to it. And I think it's useful to be able to use the technology in your class that the students can also choose to use to converse with each other as well. So that means that you're kind of bounded by what your university or your department is offering, which is limiting and can be frustrating, which means that you should advocate for your choices. And that means, unfortunately, maybe writing lots of emails, getting on committees or something, or at least making your voice heard. And advocating, means supporting your choices with the pedagogical choices that you're making, saying, this is the reason why I want to have this piece of technology, and here are the reasons why my course and my teaching and my students' learning won't be as good if I don't. But don't forget that you may not get what you want. And I think it's really important to not make them your students' problem. I think that things are going to be a little frustrating, inevitably, as we're all embarking on this journey that we didn't exactly sign up for, which means that at times, internet will die, like it happened just now. Technology won't cooperate, and it becomes really easy to kind of, I'm not going to say lose your temper, but reflect that to the students. And I think being human with them is fine, but I don't think it's useful for them to hear consistently from their instructors that, well, I really wanted to do X, but the university wouldn't allow me, so now we're stuck with this. You somehow have to make peace with it and move on. And the other thing is less is more. Be really, really judicious with the number of tools that you introduce in your class, and be cognizant of the fact that other courses are doing the same thing as well. Now, this doesn't mean stick to a minimum number that is, that a colleague who's teaching a completely different discipline is using, for example, but you really want to be asking yourself before you add one more tool to your tool chain, is the benefit from this that I'm going to get really going to outweigh the potential cost of my students being confused about what tool to use when? So I think one of the things I try to think about is that what you love and use regularly for a piece of technology doesn't always mean it's the best choice for your course. So I'll give you two examples. I love and use regularly Slack as a communication tool. I use it for community engagement. I use it for communication with collaborators. We're going to use it for preparing to teach. I've tried using it for my intro data science course before. It's also with the justification that a lot of data science teams use it. So why shouldn't my students be exposed to that? But turns out actually discussion forum software, things like Piazza that are designed specifically for students asking questions, have the features that really help you help your students a lot better than free-form text. So to give you an example, on Slack, for example, you can't edit messages your students write. And sometimes they write questions where things are not properly formatted, and it makes it really hard for other students to actually follow. It becomes hard to go back in history to an earlier conversation because you can't tag them, and there's not a great way to do threading, even though it's there. No one really uses it very well. So it becomes hard. At the same time, another tool I'll mention is GitHub, for example. I use it for version control and collaboration as well. And there I've made the decision to incorporate that into my course because I think the learning gains that the students are going to get from it outweigh the cost of learning it. So I think you want to have this conversation about any piece of technology you're introducing, especially if you're going kind of outside of the tool chain that they might be seeing in their other courses. And lastly, free to use does not mean free to learn. There's a lot of software out there, this app, that is actually free to use. And so it sometimes feels like, well, I'm not really adding any sort of kind of financial burden to my students by using this, but that doesn't mean that the time and energy they're going to need to spend to actually learn it and incorporate it. And each time they need to, they're confused about a concept in your class, to think, okay, now which tool do I use to ask my professor a question versus my group mates a question? So we want to try to kind of minimize that sort of cognitive load as much as possible. Another one is the two kind of extremes could be can't build community without everyone in the same place at the same time, versus can't have synchronicity while being fair and equitable. I think this idea of, our classrooms were communities where people showed up in person is something that's very near and dear to my heart. And it sometimes becomes really hard to think, how can we achieve that online? But at the same time, soon as we require an engagement like this, for example, where we're requiring students to be synchronously online all the time, it becomes really hard to keep things fair and equitable for your students. So again, I think the right place is somewhere in between these two. I think that before thinking about a synchronous event or synchronous kind of engagement with your students, you don't want to just think about the value of that synchronous event, but the added value of it. So attending a synchronous lecture, I think, has some added values to other things. You get to see each other's faces, and I don't think you can I think that is a useful thing for many, many people at least. And you get to hear others' questions and the answers to those. And I think that's incredibly valuable as well. But if we think about something like working on a problem as a small group, so that could be a team-based activity, that could be a pair programming thing. We get the seeing each other's faces and hearing each other's questions, but we also get the thinking together and learning from each other. And I think that creating synchronous engagement opportunities for your students, where it's more like the working on a problem as a small group, is going to have a much higher added value than just a synchronous lecture, where they could be engaged, but it may not necessarily outweigh the cost. So what are the challenges of these synchronous engagements? You want to ask yourself, and the answers will depend on where you're teaching. What is the geography that your students are coming from? Are they geographically distributed over the world, many, many time zones? Or are they mostly local, and actually daytime for you is daytime for them and for all the other students as well? And does everybody have internet access at home? And if they do they have internet access to the level that you're actually going to be able to have the video and maybe like the signing on and doing cloud computing or something like that? Is that actually going to be possible? What about their computer setup? I don't know how many of you have like a additional screen at your house, but right now, as I'm presenting, I have my notes on one screen, and I also have another screen where I'm seeing the slides, and that really, really helps me. And when I'm designing a course, I use this setup as well, but I have to remember that many of my students work only on a laptop, sometimes something like a Chromebook. So you want to really test out your materials to see, what would this experience look like on a single computer, and a small one at that? Will they actually be able to see the Zoom video and also say work on our studio full screen? And if not, is this actually valuable for them? Now, there's of course the other part of like, do they have a computer access in the first place? So that is the first thing you want to be thinking about. But even if every single student in your class says, yes, I have a laptop, that doesn't necessarily mean they have the same setup that you do. And also we want to think about living circumstances. Synchronous engagement, if it's going to be worthwhile, probably means two-way communication. That probably means that they should be able to actually have a quiet place where they can, call in and participate in something like a small group learning activity. And if that's not going to be feasible for many of your students, or even if it's a small minority, but they feel like they're really missing out on the valuable parts of your course, I think that really complicates matters. And the third thing is about how do we design asynchronous learning opportunities. That I think a lot of us think asynchronous teaching means making lots of videos. And then on the other hand, we think about, well, there's already a video on every concept I might want to teach. It's probably out there. So what do I do? Where do I stand between these two things? So I think you want to kind of be judicious again about how you're developing these asynchronous materials. So first of all, it's okay to not be an expert video maker. You should build on what you know. For example, making video animations is difficult, but making animated graphics in R or animations in, Keynote or PowerPoint might be more in your wheelhouse. So try to stick to the things you know how to make, and also think about, will learning more about this actually have added benefits for my career down the line? For example, making animated graphics in R might, but maybe learning a particular video software may or may not. So you want to be critical of that. Think beyond the camera in your laptop. So we all have these built-in, webcams, or at least most of us, in our laptops, but that's not necessarily the only video that you might be able to use. So I'm going to try to share something else with you real quick. Let's see if I can do this. And I'm going to share my time. Here we go. So this is a video that I had made as part of my Coursera course. And the reason why I want to show this is the sort of thing that I really like to teach in person, where we do like a randomization test, and I hand out playing cards to my students, and we're shuffling things, and we're actually doing this like shuffling activity by touching cards that we have in our hands. And I was thinking, well, this is going to be really difficult to replicate in a video, but what I did in the video was, you can see that the camera is actually just pointed at my hands, and you can narrate this as you're doing this, obviously, but this I did without using my laptop camera, but you could even use your cell phone camera kind of pointed at your hands, and then do something like doing the shuffling or whatever, and speed things up at some point, do the counting. And you could even do this in something synchronous, where maybe you use a Google spreadsheet where students then enter like the counts that they found, and then do the test based off of that. But what I wanted to show here is that this is actually turns out to be a low budget solution, not versus me animating this whole thing would be a lot more time consuming for me. All right, let me go back to my slides now. Where is Keynote? Okay, are you seeing the slides now? Yes?
Yeah.
Okay, great. And another thing you might think about, if you're thinking, well, a lot of what I'm teaching, others have already made the videos for this, is think about supplementing existing videos instead of recreating them. So one of the things I'm planning to do for my fall course, for example, is in addition to having these pre-recorded videos, actually watch the course discussion forum and see how students are doing on their weekly assessments, and maybe every Monday or something, release something like a 10-minute, incredibly low budget, I'm just looking at my webcam talking video, kind of like the State of the Union, being like, this is what we did last week. Here are a few things you may have struggled with. Think about what would happen if you taught, in your first lecture of the week, each week, and actually try to create those real time in the sense that you just record them at the end of a week for the following week. And that will actually make students feel like, yes, something is happening real time, even though the information delivery is not necessarily happening in a synchronous session. I think that if you are creating things like videos, making a plan for what your video is going to look like is incredibly, incredibly helpful. I actually genuinely like writing scripts. Yeah, maybe they make me sound a little bit, like a robot, but then I'm not doing ums and ahs a lot in them, and that's a lot more excruciating for you to listen to yourself. And also you can keep them a lot shorter, you don't end up rambling. Make a plan, and making a plan will also give you ideas about where you might kind of structure your shorter videos, where you might cut them off. And most importantly, learn from others. And what I mean by this is that I've worked with a lot of colleagues working videos, and I've personally made this mistake myself when I first started making videos too, where I just jumped into it. I was like, we'll hit record. I know what I'm teaching. We're ready to go. Anything that doesn't work out, I'll edit it afterwards. Well, turns out video editing is an incredibly time-consuming thing that is also not very enjoyable because you have to listen to yourself talk. But there is, you know, even journal articles published on what is a good formula for making a video. So take some time to learn and do your research a little bit as to what sort of a video making you are interested in, plan out a path for yourself, and then hit record. And also, video is only one of the many options for asynchronous engagement. So there are interactive applets. They've actually been around forever. Alan and Beth's applet collection, it has been, you know, an inspiration for a lot of things. And I've only just given 2 links here. A lot of folks produce interactive applets using the R package Shiny as well. Since we tend to do our analysis in R, that's a nice venue for doing that. And I will post these slides afterwards, by the way, so the links will be working for you. And you can also think about building interactive tutorials. So there's one example is the primers on RStudio Cloud, but using this package called LearnR, you can actually build interactive tutorials where you get to write some narrative and then stop, and students get to write some code and then move on. And finally, you can build an asynchronous community. If this was not correct, there wouldn't be Stack Overflow. There wouldn't be a Reddit community. We all know that asynchronous communities exist without people seeing each other. So how do we try to bring some of this into our own teaching? So I think one cheap way of doing it, which is a way that I'm personally not big fan of, is to say things to your students like, throughout the semester, you must post on Piazza at least 5 times, and some marks will be, you know, allocated to that. I think this sort of thing, without guidance about what those posts should be like, actually ends up being a drag for our students. But think about some other ways of doing this. Peer review, I find, is a wonderful way for getting students to interact with each other. So the link here goes to a way of doing things if you are collecting your work on GitHub, but I know that many LMS, learning management systems, also have some peer review functionality built in where you can have students exchange their work with each other, and they're interacting with each other because they're reading each other's work, but they're doing so in a meaningful way and providing feedback to them, and they get to learn about each other. Reading with collaborative note-taking. I've personally done this with Google Docs in the past, where I would add some questions to my readings, and as soon as you put questions on anything, students will ask for the answers. And so I said, all right, you guys write the answers. Here are some Google Docs associated with it, and they would develop those answers, kind of crowdsource them, but they get to interact with each other that way. There's a system called Perusal. I think it's from a faculty member at Harvard that basically allows you to do annotating as you are reading, and you can do that as part of a class. I will say that I haven't used it myself, but I've been intrigued by it and have been reading about it over the past couple weeks. And then another thing is you can actually have some sort of like opt-in virtual communication. This is something I've used in a professional setting, but I'm planning to incorporate in my teaching a tool called Virtual Donut. So people opt in, and if they do, it will randomly select maybe once a week, assign you to somebody, and then say, find 15 minutes to have a virtual donut with them. So you get on a call and you actually get to chat with each other. Some students, I'm thinking, might be interested in doing that. So, and I want to say a few words about like challenges for new faculty coming into this new reality. First, you might not have the previous experience to know pain points for students, and it might be harder to get that feedback from them online. So take advantage of your senior colleagues' experience. Ask them what are the things students tend to struggle with, but also reach out to other networks. So there's the section on stats and data science on ASA communities, but we also have another community there for online teaching resources as well. ISOStat was mentioned. Our studio community has a thread on teaching, and obviously the Slack as well. Another thing is that you actually might be more experienced in this than the senior faculty in your department. Maybe you've taken online courses so far and they might be less likely to, or you might at least be more adventurous. So I think it's useful to reach beyond your department, and especially to colleagues teaching similar teaching in similar disciplines like quantitative disciplines, for example, and take advantage of your university's, whatever. I'm sure there is now at this point at any university some sort of there were always like learning centers, and now they probably do work on online learning as well. So get in touch with them the day you get there. And finally, I think this is the kind of the heartbreaking one. You might miss out on one of the most rewarding aspects of being faculty, which is personal interactions with students. But there are some things you can do. Make yourself available, because you won't be running into them in the hallway anymore or walking out of class with them. But maybe you keep your office hours more regularly for shorter amounts of time. Do virtual coffee with your students. Use an appointment scheduling service, for example, so they can sign up to have a 10-minute coffee with you or half an hour. And also just remember that this won't be forever. I hope that this is, I think we're going to learn a lot from teaching remotely, and it will undoubtedly change how we teach going forward. But this idea of not seeing your students in person, I don't think will be forever. And at the end, I have an incomplete list of sources of a bunch of webinars and blog posts, a lot of work from the Carpentries, who tends to do kind of virtual workshops a lot. And then also recently today, I just asked people, like, what are some resources that people have loved as they've taught? And I think you'll see a similar thread here. People answer this question with, this is how I write on my screen, because that seems to be one of the challenging things to do now that you can't just turn over to the whiteboard and start scribbling stuff. So in the slides, this is a live link, so you can follow up with that thread there. And with that, I'll stop and see if we have any questions. All right.
Nina, I think I've set up that I'm on my phone, so my internet is not working, but you can definitely hear me, I think. And
yes, we can hear you.
Okay, so that I'm on my husband's phone and I'm using my other phone for a hotspot, which is not working super well, but I can try to share my slides, but maybe as a backup, if you don't mind also having my slides, and then maybe like I could do it and then have you advance.
Yeah, absolutely. I'd be happy to do that. So let me see if there is maybe one or so question I might take, and then we'll move over to Lucy. So there's one comment about using GitHub in the classroom. So I will add resources related to that, and maybe one of our later calls might be about that. I'd be happy to do that. So one question says, has anyone created questions that were able to assess students' access that seemed to work well and were equitable? Thinking of how you could get an idea of where your students fell with respect to the list of challenges. I have not done this yet. And one of the challenges that I have faced when I tried to do this was that my university actually said, let's do that in a more central way, as opposed to individual instructors asking similar questions, which I think is a good idea, but requires maybe at least at the department level, a little bit of cross-collaboration in order to be able to get that information. I don't know if others have had experience with that.
We did ask individually, and I can see that being annoying to students, but it's mostly just asking what they had available, kind of what the common things were in terms of webcam, stuff like that. But I also made them do a little internet speed test to give me a sense of what kind of capabilities they would have for some things.
Oh, that's a good idea. Okay, and then let's see, even if synchronous activities are optional and we believe that synchronicity has good added value, are we still inherently disadvantaging students who aren't able to participate in that way? I think yes, I don't think there's a way to necessarily say no to that question. However, it might be possible. So I think one of the things that's important to keep in mind is that wherever you teach, students have different learning styles. And one way to try to cater to as many as possible is to provide different options, opportunities for learning. So I think if you are adding a synchronous component, it's useful to think about, for a student who may only be able to watch a video of this and not actually participate, what would be a similar experience that we could provide in some other way? And I think in that case, I would think about some of the options I listed in terms of asynchronous, but still providing an opportunity for students to communicate with each other in some way.